Ken Leth was born in 1955 in central Nebraska to a working-class family. From an early age, Ken claims to have had memories of a past life in northern France near a river where he believes he lived in the late 1700s or early 1800s. In his memories, Ken recalls being a young man who worked harvesting reeds along the river that were used for housing materials. He became ill, possibly from disease, injury, or infection, and passed away in his home while lying on a dirt floor covered in hay. After dying in that past life, Ken says he floated out of his body and hovered above the small hut he lived in. He felt happy to be freed from his sick and dying body. Ken then elevated further into the sky and saw a brilliant, warm light which he moved toward. That's where the memories of that lifetime end. Ken's next recalled spiritual experience was encountering a guide he refers to as his guardian angel in a realm beyond Earth. This guide seemed to communicate telepathically with Ken through a mental exchange of thoughts and feelings. The guide told Ken he needed more learning and growth before returning to Earth. Ken was then brought before a council of elders, authoritative figures who questioned Ken about what he learned in his past life. Ken struggled to answer their questions, especially about the concept of love. His guide encouraged him to try his best to answer sincerely. After this council evaluation, the guide told Ken there was a loving young couple on Earth trying to have a baby that Ken could be born to if he chose to return to Earth. The guide showed Ken visions of the couple filled with laughter and affection. Ken agreed, hoping to understand love through their care. Ken has vague memories of then descending into his mother's womb to be born into his current lifetime in 1955. When the contractions stopped during his delivery, Ken sensed danger. He remembers becoming detached from his infant body and floating freely around the room, meeting another spirit who he sensed was a girl, though he didn't know her identity. This girl spirit encouraged Ken to stay close until he was called back into his body and successfully born. Unfortunately, during the delivery, Ken's mother had been accidentally overdosed with nitrous oxide by the attending doctor who left her unattended with the gas mask nearby while he went for a cigarette break with Ken's father. She nearly died during the childbirth. After being revived, she felt immense guilt that the lack of oxygen may have caused brain damage or developmental issues for her newborn son. Consequently, she was very protective of Ken throughout his childhood, always worried he might behave strangely and embarrass himself. Ken believes this over-sheltering negatively affected his social skills and personality development. At 8 years old, in November 1963, a week before JFK's assassination, Ken developed severe appendicitis. His mother hesitated to take him to the doctor at first, downplaying his symptoms. By the time he was hospitalized and prepped for emergency surgery, his condition was critical. While under anesthesia on the operating table, Ken had a full-blown near-death experience where he found himself floating in darkness. At first, everything was black and silent until scenes emerged. Ken saw the spirits of people who had passed on Earth rapidly ascend upward into a warm light. He wondered where they might be going. Soon, two entities approached Ken in this dark space. They seemed to derive joy from his unease and moved in closer to torment him. When Ken begged for God to help him, they bitterly recoiled, seemingly unable to tolerate the sincere call for divine help. Then a being Ken describes as an angel approached him, driving away the malevolent specters. The figure glowed brightly and was adorned in flowing white robes tied with a belt. It also had a horn slung over its shoulder and a sword it used to cut Ken's silver tether, tying him to his body so he could move freely. As has been explored previously, it is common for such beings in near-death experiences to take on strong cultural archetypes. For example, depictions of angels reminiscent of classical works of art are commonly reported by those of a Christian background, while those of Eastern religions may report encountering enlightened figures from their respective faiths. It is suspected that such symbolic appearances are employed to appeal to a person's cultural familiarity, and in doing so, provide comfort. The angel questioned why Ken had called out to God in this dark space between lives. Being able to view Ken's memory of attending church as a child, the entity determined Ken had some concept of a higher power to cry out to. After consoling the terrified boy, the being encased Ken in a glowing bubble of protection so he could safely travel to the higher realms of the spirit plane. Ken rose high over Earth through a cosmos filled with stars and galaxies. He noticed other human spirits traveling up through tube-like structures to enter spinning tunnels. Inside the tunnels, brilliant lights flashed, and Ken felt a sense of motion pulling him through to an unfamiliar realm. On the other side, Ken found himself alone, floating in darkness once more. After a pause, two arms reached down through an object resembling a cloud, grasped Ken by the shoulders, and pulled him up through what he would later come to realize was a higher dimension. There, Ken was greeted by a man named Eddie, who was the cousin of Ken's father. Eddie had died around 1951 in the Korean War before Ken was born. Eddie brought Ken to meet other relatives who were puzzled by his identity at first. However, once Ken shared his name and that of his father's, Eddie's grandparents on Ken's father's side exclaimed happily to discover Ken was their grandson, though they had passed away long before he was born. A celebration commenced at Ken's arrival as he met various ancestors. One great-grandmother explained that a very special person was coming to greet Ken. He soon saw a man approach, bathed in light, whom Ken's great-grandmother identified as her son. This luminous figure transformed into a kindly bearded man dressed in robes whom Ken understood to be spiritually significant somehow. This elevated spirit played with Ken as an adult would play innocently with a child. In a dazzling display, he then transformed into an orb of light, which flooded Ken with immense feelings of love and joy. Ken was then brought before an even brighter light, which he understood to be God, based on the deep, rumbling voice that spoke to him with great warmth and care. God explained that just as Jesus sacrificed himself out of love to serve God's will, Ken also had opportunities in his life to make sacrifices and serve others, which would earn him spiritual rewards and growth. After this, the figure Ken would come to refer to simply as Mother returned. She showed Ken a life review from birth to that point at age 8. One moment that particularly stood out was witnessing his difficult birth from above. He watched as a doctor harshly swatted his silent newborn body to get him breathing after the nitrous oxide overdose caused complications. Mother then allowed Ken to access special zones that seemed to activate implicit knowledge of a deeper reality, which he believes all conscious beings to have. Ken felt he obtained insights into humanity's relationship with nature and cosmic purpose. Mother and the advanced spirit that had earlier gifted Ken with immense love and joy then guided him to a vast room containing a model of Earth on a pedestal. There, other spiritual entities manipulated controls under the base while monitoring and maintaining this replica planet and its history. Ken learned this was a universal record of sorts, containing all past and future events on Earth. He first viewed a busy city scene far in humanity's ancient past with people riding donkeys and carts, which didn't hold his interest long. Next, Ken witnessed a possible vision of the future after being told he would see events from his lifetime if he returned to Earth. The first scene showed the Kennedy assassination from an overhead perspective, with people crying as the president's car sped away. It is worth noting that this apparent encounter with the afterlife and the subsequent foresight of this event occurred a full week before the shooting in November 1963. Another entity supervising the experience told Ken that it is major world events that shape humanity's destiny, and that, as such, intervention is not allowed. For example, preventing the incoming assassination from happening. The being then rapidly skipped through the timeline, showing Ken glimpses of a second American Civil War, social unrest, scientific advances, global catastrophes, and outer space voyages. Ken also specifically recalled seeing Hillary Clinton campaigning for president with Bill by her side. The turbulent Trump presidency flashed by, with people protesting in the streets. He vividly observed the January 6th Capitol insurrection from above. Nuclear warfare, perhaps as the result of an escalation of a Third World War, appeared to come later. He watched as gigantic mushroom clouds erupted across the planet, resulting in a major loss of life, perhaps decades after Ken's lifetime. After a period living very simply, Ken saw humans with a newfound wisdom and humility beginning to rebuild civilization anew, living in cooperation with nature. Mother then returned to Ken to inform him that his deceased relatives were waiting for him to decide whether he wanted to return to his body or not. Ultimately, Ken made the decision to go back to his incarnated self after being told that his mother on Earth was praying for him and would be grief-stricken if he passed. Before sending Ken back into his recovering body, Mother told him he must not remember his future visions nor speak of them as a child. She said being a child prophet with such foreknowledge would make life very burdensome. Mother then apparently suppressed those precognitive memories to protect Ken until he was mature enough to process such information. Back on Earth, Ken healed from his surgery and grew up sheltered by his protective mother. He had no memory of the future events witnessed during his near-death experience until he was in his 20s. Vivid dreams and visions were sent to reawaken Ken's suppressed memories of almost dying and meeting with those in the afterlife. Ken kept his astonishing childhood experience private until he finally shared it publicly in the 2010s. He felt compelled to warn humanity about the dangers of the rising political divisions he had foreseen. But he realized predictions have limits, and humanity ultimately walks the path of its own choosing. Having shared what he could, Ken now focuses on living in the present moment with an open, honest heart and a playful sense of humor.